Welcome to 20th Century Geek.
So, I see you received the ticket I sent you. I'm glad. I did so want you to be here, you see. It doesn't matter if you catch me and send me back to the asylum. Gordon's been driven mad. I've proved my point. I've demonstrated there's no difference between me and everyone else. All it takes is one bad day to reduce the sanest man alive to lunacy. That's how far the world is from where I am. Just one bad day. You had a bad day once. Am I right? I know I am. I can tell. You had a bad day and everything changed. Why else would you dress up like a flying rat? You had a bad day, and it drove you as crazy as everybody else. Only you won't admit it. You have to keep pretending that life makes sense, that there's some point to all this struggling. God, you make me want to puke. I mean, what is it with you? What made you what you are? Girlfriend killed by the mob, maybe? Brother carved up by some mugger. Something like that, I bet. Something like that. Something like that happened to me, you know. I'm not exactly sure what it was. Sometimes I remember it one way and sometimes another. If I'm going to have a past, I prefer to have multiple choice. But my point is, I went crazy. When I saw what a black, awful joke the world was, I went crazy as a coot. I admit it. Why can't you? I mean, you're not unintelligent. You must see the reality of the situation. Do you know how many times we've come close to World War III over a flock of geese on a computer screen? Do you know what triggered the last World War? An argument over how many telegraph poles Germany owed its war debt creditors. Telegraph poles! It's all a joke. Everything everybody ever valued or struggled for is all a monstrous, demented gag. So why can't you see the funny side? Why aren't you laughing?
Welcome to 20th Century Geek. I'm Scott Weatherly, your usual host. And I'm hoping that you can tell from the intro we just did that we're going to be covering The Killing Joke today. It's 30 years old this month and still stands out as one of the best graphic novels ever written, possibly the best Joker story ever written as well. But we won't get into that now because I spoke to a man recently who's definitely in the know, Julian Darius, the man who created Sickwat, and in fact wrote the book on The Killing Joke. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass you straight over to myself and our interview with Julian Darius. Let's start with some introductions, so we can get the listeners knowing who you are and why you want to talk about this book. So, if you want to introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Julian Darius. I am the founder of Sickwat Organization, which has existed for about 22 years to promote comics as a legitimate form of art. And we've done a lot of books and movies, including a book I wrote on Batman we did that too, but on Batman Killing Joke. And now I'm making comics with Martian Lit.
Yes, I saw your Kickstarter, so you can definitely promote that if you want to throw some information
Yeah.
out there so people can find it.
Yeah, sure. If you go to Kickstarter and search for The Synthetics, it's Synthetics #1, big robot battle on Mars. So thank you.
Excellent. No, it's all good. I've had a look at it. I've put some money into it, so hopefully it'll get its targets.
Bless you. Thank you.
So, Sequat to begin with, I came across Sequat sort of just when I was rambling and ambling around the internet, and I came across Greg Carpenter's book, The British Invasion, which sort of got me onto it. And since sort of coming across it, I bought quite a few of your books now. I've got several on Grant Morrison and other bits and pieces. I do like the take, that more analytical sort of academic take. It's definitely opened my eyes to reading books in a different way. So, from that point of view, why did you start Sequat?
Well, as an undergraduate, and at the time, this was the 90s, and my professors, who I respected a lot, did not really see comics as literary. And I would tell them, yeah, this stands on par with literary stuff and anything in the canon, and you're discriminating against this form of art. And I had one professor who I was very good friends with say, well, if you want to make that argument, you need to stop calling it comics, because that goes back to funny comic strip. And I thought, well, we're never going to win with some people. So I just kind of started assembling resources for studying different comics and articles that I was writing, just for the fun of it, not for any class. Then I found people, I knew wanted to work for it and wanted to write for it as a website. This is, pretty early in, the web. And, so to me, and then they worked for it, and, we just kind of expanded from there and did our first book in 2005 and our first movie not that long after. So to me, it was a reaction to seeing that there was a hole that needed to be filled, that there wasn't that respect, and we needed to have it.
No, good. And I'm glad it's there. So, so having that background then, and that was your sort of what you were setting up then. When did you first come across The Killing Joke?
Oh, well, I mean, before any of that, it must have been maybe a year after it came out or something. All that stuff from the 80s, and I guess Killing Joke is 89. And I think all that stuff I read a little late because I was so young.
Yeah.
And I kind of had the impression that, like, Dark Knight had been around 5-10 years, and really I was reading it, like, as soon as the trade came out. So I didn't have much of an idea of, at the time, of, like, when it had actually come out. I would have been reading comics pretty regularly and seriously when it came out, but I'm sure I just picked it up, in some good comic store and had no idea really how old it was.
Yeah. It's one of those things, like you say, it's sort of the cover itself is very striking. The joke with the camera. So from the offset, you're sort of brought in. You're dragged into it, not knowing. I think I had a very similar thing, and I started reading comics in the 90s, and it's one of those I'd heard people talking about. I'd seen it on things, and it's one of those. If you read comics, you should have read this. And I remember picking it up without any real preconceived notions of what was inside, but being very struck by the cover straight off. So you bought it. I was bought into it from the offset, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think that, obviously that cover is very striking, and I think that as soon as you pick it up, I'm assuming that both of us got it in the prestige format, and that's really I'm glad that it's included in, like, the DC work of Alan Moore, but it's so obviously intended to be read in that prestige format as a single issue book, with the embossed cover and just to have that thickness, that heft to it.
Yeah.
And it would work fine as, like in the hardcover edition works fine too. But just to sort of open it and see it as art object.
It's almost, yeah, it's an interesting story because the more research I did about it, it's that there's it's not clear, whether Alan Moore meant this to be something special or if he just saw it as filler or whatever. But Brian Boland especially, he spent that long doing it, that it was definitely something special for him.
Yeah, and Moore has kind of disowned it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I always take everything he disowns with a pinch of salt, though, because he disowns everything that's in mainstream comics. So I think,
Well, that is very true, and of course, it's not really relevant anyway because lots of authors have disparaged their own work or disowned or even lied about their own work. And if it's great and it affects lots of people, that's great. It doesn't take anything away from what they did. But I like to hear you say that because there are people who will just say, "Oh, the author's intent or the author's voice is all that matters here."
yeah, I mean, but when you call, like you say, you refer to this as an art piece, and I think the art is so critical to this, both in the original Prestige and I'd say in the the reprinted or the deluxe edition. Everything Brian Boland's pencil work in this is so good. The thing is, I knew Brian Boland way before this, being a child of Britain. I sort of know 2000 AD, and so know Brian Boland's work from that, doing Judge Dredd and Rogue Trooper and things like that. So to see him, this is that's him doing a weekly comic. This is him doing an exquisite piece of work. The colouring, I think, does matter. I mean, what do you think about the two different formats? Like, which has the bigger impact for you? The original formatting with the slightly psychedelic colouring, or the redone colouring?
Yeah, I think the redone coloring is better. I think it's kind of objectively better. Like there are places where Higgins' original colors are a bit off, or where you can't even see some detail. But I think it suffers from some of the problems that plagued like recoloring the Incal a few years back, where you get a little. You look at it and people are inevitably going to think, well, it doesn't have the same sort of flat psychedelic effect. And there are times where I feel that, but I still look at the new stuff and think it's better. I can see more, and the gradients are not overly applied, which I think was kind of the case with the Incal. It's not just updated and the gradients are crazy, and you feel like it's a totally different book. I don't feel that way. Do you?
No, not at all. I definitely think it benefits from it. I mean, I'd go so far as to say it's actually an easier read. It's a clearer read, like you say, with the recolouring. And even some of the more iconic panels, I think, benefit from the recolouring. Even, the difference between but the present day story and the flashbacks. I quite like the sort of the red motif that goes throughout the flashbacks and all that kind of thing. I think it looks neater.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wanted to ask about Boland. Isn't it sad that this was his last? I agree with everything you're saying. This was his last major interior work. That he did that weekly work for 2000 AD and a million other places, and was obviously a master draftsman. And then he does this. Take your time and embrace the prestige graphic novel kind of format. And then it's just, well, that took too much time. I'm going to stick to covers. I don't mean to be unfair to him there. In fact, I think he had so much promise. I mean, it's great every time I'm going back and reading 2000 AD and I hit the Boland chapter, it's like, yes! But I've always been sad that, he didn't do another or keep in that same vein.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, there's artists of this era, late 80s, early 90s, when when you had the graphic novel was sort of taken off. And then I think of others that Alan Moore did, or Neil Gaiman. And I think of like Dave McKean, and what he did with things, and I think, there was a missed opportunity there, that if he'd have partnered with somebody else of that period and done just another piece of work, I think it'd have been brilliant. Or even him doing something like when Vertigo took off. So, if he'd have done some part of Constantine or contributed to Sandman or something, I think it'd have been brilliant. But yeah, it is a real shame.
Yeah. I feel that way too.
How do you think it stands out? Because it comes in that period of time. So this came out in '88, where you'd had Dark Knight, the Return of the Dark Knight, you'd had Watchmen, you got that rise of the adult comic, they say the more adult comics and stuff. I've seen different people commenting on this being both a continuation of that, but also almost like a response to it. So the violence and the sort of insanity in this almost being a response to that, maturation of comics.
Yeah, I'm interested in what the argument would be that it's a response. I think that Moore was kind of continuing in that vein. I mean, Moore did not seem to have been. Well, I mean, he wrote the introduction to Dark Knight. I mean, and he did not seem to have been, like committed to just making violent superhero stories. But the reality is that, like you said, you kind of have to take what he says with a little grain of salt. That he was like, oh, I always plan to write after Watchmen something, like a funny animal comic.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm exaggerating as I claim that, but sometimes you get that kind of thing, and you say, well, yeah, that is not going to happen. That was not going to happen. The market at that time expected these kinds of stories, and it is a smarter, sort of more literary story. It's a more artistic story than Dark Knight, just in terms of its construction and the panel layout and all of this. But I don't know that it's not in that vein. I'm wondering what the argument would be that it's.
I think I saw an article that it used the basis of saying that basically all the violence is what the Joker's is going against. It's the insanity of it all. Like, you're just going to go crazy with with the increasing levels of violence. And was it a comment on that's the only pursuit now, is that these comics are going to get more violent and more aggressive and that sort of thing. It's, and to have the Joker comment on that would probably be is an interesting statement to make, I suppose.
Yeah, this is. I see it now. This is this our last chance to not kill each other? Is this our last chance to not sort of escalate? But yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that the story is so violent to me. It's so. I mean, Alan Moore can say that he dashed it off, and by the time it came out, he didn't care about it, and he didn't intend it to be a major story. But I feel as if certainly when he was writing it, he cared about it.
Yeah.
He might not have been aware that it was going to be in the prestige format or get all of this acclaim, because frankly, he wasn't Alan Moore yet in 1987. He didn't have that level of clout. But I mean, I don't know how well. The thing that haunts me about how well it holds up is the treatment of women.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's odd that it's no comment on even on Moore, because he's been cited from his 80s work as a bit of a misogynist. I've heard it said. You get the treatment of Barbara Gordon in this. You get the treatment of the first Silk Spectre in Watchmen. That sort of thing, but. Really, when you look at his other works, there's characters like Promethea, and we did Lost Girls as well. But he definitely has, I won't say feminist, but equal values. It just so happens, I think this came out in an era when this was probably shocking in a different way. But what are your thoughts on it, really, from especially obviously the treatment of Barbara Gordon?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's troubled, and my thoughts are troubled about it, because when it came out, obviously that wasn't the focus. And I think that, in its context, not that nobody was raising these questions or these concerns, but, when I had that kind of conversation closer to those days, that conversation tended to be one that was very understanding of like, well, this is a Batman and Joker story. And yeah, it'd be nice to see Barbara in the hospital, but I get it. I'm a fan of her character. I don't like seeing that, but I acknowledge the story. I mean, it would be this kind of, well, it's a Batman and Joker story, and look, DC did not care about Barbara Gordon. DC was only too happy to have her shot and paralyzed. And obviously you're going to have some fans. I mean, so that suggests to me there weren't a lot of fans of the character at the time that DC was concerned about alienating. So I think that in its place, I don't want to say you can never bring up something from a later period and judge an early work, because I don't totally believe that's true. But I think at its time, in its context, it was a mature Batman story that's centrally about Batman and the Joker. And, Alan Moore wanted a little more oomph, a little more way of grinding in that, twisting that knife into Gordon. And that's the function that Barbara's torture serves.
I think the question is as well, let's say, take it in context. I mean, this eventually was quite quickly taken into continuity. and Barbara becomes Oracle and all that kind of thing. But from possibly the original intention, this to be like an Elseworld story, out of continuity. If you were to take this cold, then it almost like you do, she's got there's no mention of her being Batgirl in this book at all. So if you were to come in this as an early reader, then does it have less impact because it's just Gordon's daughter? Is it supposed to be? I mean, I've always taken it as, I think maybe not naivety, but it's almost like Joker doesn't know that she's Batgirl. Like, he doesn't care. Like, none of that to him is important. And it's to show that the randomness of all this is just whoever opens the door is going to get shot. That could have been Gordon, it could have been her, it could have been anybody. It's just the randomness of it. But I suppose it's just how it's been. It's the discussion, is, like I say, the context of it as well.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, that there's no reason to think that he knows that she's Batgirl, and that's both highlights that randomness, but it's also potentially insulting. Like, you wouldn't have a stranger. Bruce Wayne is not going to go out because of a Joe Chill shooting him in an alley, not knowing he's Batman. So I don't know. I mean, I think the older I get, the more I'm disturbed by it. I think the older I get, the more I feel like I still react against the idea that it's I don't like when an entire work is dismissed as trash, which you sometimes see, or it's the word misogynist or sexist is is leveraged in a kind of way to suggest you're bad to read this or like this. This is just garbage, and because the reality is 99% of all art that's ever been made is sexist or racist or classist or something in its era.
Yeah.
But I do having with all of those caveats. I mean, the older I get, the more I feel like, why is there not a Barbara hospital scene? Like, why is she just dropped out of the narrative? Her function is to be a prop for the men.
Yeah.
I'm going to torture your daughter to anger you and make Batman come after me. And I think when I first read it, I did not see implied rape at all. I mean, I guess I was an innocent little boy.
Yeah.
But taking photos of her naked is definitely there. I mean, even if you don't focus on the implied rape, this is a horrible assault, and I guess what bothers me the most is that she's not given interior space. You see her in pain, but the point is to generate imagery, almost like porn, to upset, and then she's just dismissed. She's disposable to the plot, and I think that element more just takes that a little too far. And the older I get, the more that's the thing that disturbs me about the book.
No, I agree. I think there are certain elements of it. I mean, like you say, the photographs. I to and fro on the panel where Gordon's being shown the photographs of his daughter, and she's clearly been stripped naked, and it's like the implied rape and that. But then that implies almost the sexualization of the Joker, which I've always taken to be asexual. Like, it's not an issue to him. It's not a thing. But would he go there? The thing I find bizarre is at the end of it, when Batman turns up to save Gordon, takes him out the cage, at no point does he actually reassure Gordon that she's fine.
Yeah, you're right.
It's just weird. Yeah, he doesn't say your daughter's fine or she's been taken to hospital or anything. Like, it's not even part of the. All he says is he shot Barbara, showed me the photographs, and then Batman runs off. And I do find that's really callous, especially, like you say, when the relationship between Batman and Batgirl. So it's
yeah. Well, and also, you're talking to a father, and I get that he is a tough cop, and it's Gordon,
yeah.
But still, isn't he going to be more concerned about his father than getting the bad guy, and about his daughter, and then getting the bad guy in that moment, and exactly what tactics are used,
Well, exactly, but also coming from let's be honest, Batman Bruce Wayne is nothing more than a mourning son. He's a grieving son. So to be essentially a grieving child, to not reassure a parent of another child's well-being seems off, really. It always has done to me.
I agree. And I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think that I agree with you that that's always feels off. And I think that I don't know that I would have not just ignored it, upon first reading it, but I think that as time goes on, these flaws become more apparent, and the sort of dazzle of just what Moore and Bolland did fades, and we're more aware of what it looks like and what the structure looks like and where the story's going. These flaws kind of come out, and I think that's a natural process.
Yeah. Oh, it is. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like you say, these you admire it for what it is, but then like, with anything, you as you read it more and digest it more, you're able to find out the cracks appear in everything. That's just the way it is. The thing that I circle around, I'd be interested to get your opinion on really, is the nature of the book itself being cyclical.
Yeah.
So you get, as you said, as you mentioned, the first panel and the last panel are exactly the same, suggesting that it's, goes round and round. And the thing that sort of, like, especially in this reading, when I've read it a couple of times since Christmas, really, was there's no trigger for this event. So, both Batman and the Joker are on a path. Like, something has triggered them to be in a place where the Joker wants to prove that one bad day can turn you into him, can turn you crazy. And Batman is on a path of almost looking to help redeem. He's using the Joker, I think, as an example, but to redeem some of his other villains. And the question I came away with more and more was why? What event or what has happened for Batman to be on that path, and what event has triggered the Joker's frustration in order to put this, really intricate plan in place just to prove a point? Like, what has triggered that? I don't understand where they're coming from. So there's almost like a lack of motivation on both parts.
I'm more troubled by that lack of motivation on the Joker's part. And you're absolutely right. I remember thinking when every time I read Batman Summoned to Arkham, and I think, how did he get this guy in there with makeup on? How long ago did this happen? Why did he choose now to escape? The point about the intricate plan, I mean, it reminds me of the movie The Dark Knight, which is justifiably praised. I mean, I think it's the pinnacle of superhero movies, but that suffers from the same problem of the Joker totally changes his motivation over the course of that film, and is constantly saying, I'm an anarchist, while actually putting together unbelievably elaborate plans that have key points that require things that he could not predict. So, I mean, yeah, you're completely right. There's no inciting incident. And I think that maybe that goes to the cyclical nature of the story, but this is a point at which it kind of falls down. Not only is there no inciting incident, but what do you make of that final joke, and where is this going to go? I think that for me, it kind of reads like an interesting literary experiment, and it reads like a prelude for Dark Knight Returns, or indeed the death of Jason Todd, which came out right after, and which is sort of intended as a bridge between Killing Joke and Dark Knight Returns.
No, I agree. I mean, that's the thing I say. What you say is, it feels like the middle chapter of a trilogy.
Yes, you're absolutely. That's brilliant. That's completely correct. Who is this Barbara? You've not even established backgrounds. Not even true. And why are they both the Batman and the Joker set on this? Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like it's hinting toward another one. Yeah, I mean, I think that's dead on. He just wrote Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I want my Batman Ewoks.
Empire's a good one. We'll just write that.
Yeah.
Damn if it's not good, but yeah, you are. I think that's a brilliant way of putting it.
Well, let's get to the end then, really, because I think we get to the interpretation of the end, and this became a bit of a thing probably in the last sort of I don't know when it was, about 5 years, when I'd never even thought of this interpretation of this book until Grant Morrison appeared on Kevin Smith's Fat Man on Batman, and basically said, well, of course this is the last Joker story. Like, Batman kills the Joker. That's the killing joke. And I remember hearing it and straight away sort of thinking, well, I'm happy for you to read it that way, but that's totally like not how I've ever read this. But it seems to be almost like the majority now take it that way.
Well, I don't know. I have no idea what the majority do. I mean, I feel so completely alienated from my own American culture. I feel completely alienated from comics reading culture today. I have no idea what the majority do on anything. But yeah, I mean, that was the one time after the Fat Man on Batman. That was the one time that I have ever been able to get publicity for something I've written based on just the timing, because I was able to say, I talked about this theory in my book, which was published like a couple of years ago. And so I got Kevin Smith talked about me and talked about my book. I was,
Cool.
Yeah, I got a little fanboy, the guy who did Clerks talked about it. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's not a definitive reading. I mean, to me, I thought of it because, in my reading of it, what I propose in the book is that there's this odd page with the Joker's needle in his palm.
Yeah.
And, it's so bizarre. And really, the easiest answer to that is, well, Bolland screwed up, and Alan Wolf didn't care enough to come back to it. But, the Joker, Batman's looking at his hand very strangely right after this. Like, he's knocked the needle out of Joker's hand. He falls over and he's looking at his hand in this odd way. And it's just, now, in theory, I guess that there's some notes or something from Bolland where Bolland says, he's looking at his, it's the most inconsequential thing. It's like he's looking at his hand grip in his palm or something.
Yeah.
So the way, which is not even drawn in any other scene, is something that might slide or be worth looking at. It just seems such a unsatisfactory answer to me. The reality is, and I think producing comics now, I see this, is that you write a script, an artist hands you back art. And that art stresses things that were not necessarily important to you, and does not stress as much the moment or the emotion that was at the heart of the story for you. Now, you can intervene and give notes, but at the end of the day, what you get back is based on the blueprint that you wrote.
Yeah.
Now, at that point, you can go in and you can change dialogue and you can tweak whatever you want, and I think not enough writers do that. But at the end of the day, your original intent doesn't really matter, and what you have is what's on the page, and what's on the page is weird there, and what's on the page made me as a kid wonder what is going on that final page. The way Batman and Joker are sort of like in silhouette, and Bolland is so precise in his art, and suddenly they're just kind of like wavy, and they're buddies, and it's weird, and you cut to the ground, and why does Batman have this expression of like mania on his face? It all just struck me as weird, and I always felt like there's something more there that's being concealed from the reader. So that was my reaction in like 1990.
Yeah.
You don't have that reaction.
No, but that it's what you said to begin with is so right. Like, you say it starts with a script and the art is produced and they go together and they create, let's say, a page. Now that page, once it's in the public eye or the public domain, can be interpreted in a whole bunch of different ways because of that person. Whoever's reading it brings a certain level of background and legacy with them. I mean, for me, so when I read it, because this is, I'm intrigued to see your idea, because when I read the two panels, I think about, Batman gets hit around the head with the plank. He's adjusting his cowl, and I've always taken the top half of the sort of the page where he's adjusting his cowl, and like you say, he's got his hand in a funny position. The way I always interpret it is they can't depict speed because it's obviously static art, but those panels are supposed to be like really quick. And I've always taken it, the moment he catches the Joker's hand, from that first panel of the top of that page to that panel is literally like, a split second. And it's showing that one arm just moves in that instant and he's able to catch it. And it feels like he was trying to show speed of reflex, and that's why the other hand hasn't moved much at at that point. But it does look weird. It's almost it's.
I mean, you're right about the gutter, right? Like how can you control time? It's weird. Like you control time as a comics creator through panel layout, but really the reader controls how they read this and how much time has actually passed there isn't clear. But thinking of it in terms of a movie, I mean, you shot this shot from that perspective.
Yeah.
And if the point is reaction, how fast is reaction? Why is he staring at his hand?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's not clear. And how much time, even if it is a split second, you can have a split second shot in the movie. The eyes just before somebody falls or something that really is only 2 seconds, but is strange and memorable and intended to be memorable. So I don't necessarily disagree with you. I mean, it's definitely in the middle of a fight, but it just looks strange. And yes, he's adjusting his cowl, but is Batman's suit really so loose on him? Like pajamas that's got to adjust his hand every time he falls?
That has been the biggest. The one thing that's always bothered me, really, even from the very, very first interpretation, is that the Joker can pull his cowl down by just hooking the eyes. And I've always thought that, like, this isn't Adam West Batman. This isn't supposed to be that. Like, the cowl shouldn't be that daft. But yeah, it's a really interesting set of pages.
The thing I think about the cowl is you're right. It is a bit Adam West. It is a bit silly. But there was also, remember in Dark Knight Returns, there's that series of captions in which Frank Miller is trying to explain why Batman would have a bat symbol on his chest. Because normally if you're shooting at somebody to take somebody down, you're going to aim at the center of their body mass. Thank you for putting a target on the center of your body mass.
Yeah.
And Miller says, well, that's because that's the most reinforced armored section. And this is really to my mind, a kind of classic revisionist attempt to make superheroes more realistic, attempt to make their tropes make sense within a realistic world, which obviously has fallen out of fashion, but which really is inseparable from the whole, 80s art superhero movement. And so I think there might be a little bit of kind of egg on the face, a little bit of kind of poking fun at Batman and at the silliness of the suit, of the symbol, how this isn't practical going on there. But yeah, it is a little, at least get a foam rubber suit like Michael Keaton,
Yeah, that's it, yeah. You can't move his head, but at least it looks good, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think there's ambiguity on that final page, too. I mean, you can see it as just Joker and the Batman have a lot more in common than you think and that Batman thinks. And I think that is something that clearly Alan Moore intended and clearly stuck with me and has stuck with me, that really Batman is also a guy who dresses up and does crazy things.
Yeah.
And is violent. They really are two peas in a pod. And maybe this is just the weird moment where they acknowledge that. But, I mean, if Batman really does want to save him, he tells a very sad joke in a moment of sobriety. And that joke is about how there's no changing, we're going to kill each other, I'm crazy. If you interpret it in that way, this is going to keep going. And this is not going to keep going forever, because even though it looks cyclical, Batman, has said, we're going to kill, one of us is going to kill the other one. And Batman's just like, yeah, you're right. We are going to kill each other. Let's have a beer. That's a very odd interpretation too, and yet that is kind of the standard interpretation, or at least to me, it was my standard interpretation. So the idea that Batman's acting out of character and there's a reason for it, and maybe he, has been nicked by this poison thing, or in Grant Morrison's earlier reading, Grant said, that he's killing the Joker. Actually, some friends of mine who worked on the Morrison documentary said they took my theory about the needle to Grant. Grant said, "Oh, I love that. That's brilliant. I agree with that." But what I love about what Grant's doing there is, like, Grant doesn't believe in a definitive interpretation. So, if when we were doing when Tim Callahan was doing Grant Morrison in the early years, he had a whole section on how the Doom Patrol is basically Alice in Wonderland, and it's the Scarecrow, and making the Tin Man, is Cliff Steele, and making this analogy. And when he interviewed Grant about it, Grant said, I've never thought about that, but you are absolutely right. That's a great interpretation. And so Grant is one of those writers who doesn't think that they own every intellectual possibility or permutation of their work.
Yes.
So for Grant, the idea that we're still arguing about Killing Joke, and we're still arguing about what even happens in it, and coming up with cool theories about it, is amazing and awesome at how that book lives. And you can disagree with it. I don't think that he ever thinks that he is delivering the definitive account of here's what is happening in Killing Joke. Batman kills Joker.
No, and I think that's why I love this. That's the reason, we have nitpicked on it and all that sort of thing. But that's one of the reasons I love this book, is because almost depending on what mood I'm in, it will depend on the interpretation of how I take certain parts of this book. And that last page in particular, like you say, when I heard Grant Morrison's interpretation of it being the final Joker story, I could see that. I was like, oh, okay, I get it. But it's not how I've read it. And then, reading your book, and I was like, that, the Batman has done this, and he's been infected with it. I can see it now. It's sort of like, but they both work, depend on, let's say how I'm coming to the book. Recently, I read it early last year, and work was doing my head in. I was really getting stressed at work, but there was people that was like a level of camaraderie that I'll be honest with you, I may not have actually liked, but because you were in the trenches with them, you sort of work with them and everything. You'd end up having a laugh with them. And I remember reading this at one point and seeing it almost as that inappropriate laugh that you have when you're being told off. It's that heightened emotion. You've been through such a stressful situation, and then someone's like, trying to keep it serious, and then all of a sudden something just makes you laugh, and you can't stop yourself because it's really inappropriate, and then you're laughing at how inappropriate it was. And I was like, is Batman having an awkward moment? Is that what it is?
I love that. I love hearing you say that because, that really underlines the character story and how it's not just an art object, but also Batman wants to save the Joker. The Joker, I sometimes come at it from a place of, because I'm a manic depressive, so I sometimes come at it from a place of addiction and psychological disease, of that moment of clarity of the Joker where he's considering the offer, but, there is this way in which when just using I statements and speaking for myself, when I am struggling with my own depression and my own dark night of the soul, I know there's a better version of me, a healthier version of me, if I would take certain steps. If I would go out, if I would slug this off. And yet what it is that I'm feeling and who I am at the time prohibits that. And there can be these odd moments where, it's like, if you've ever talked to an alcoholic who says, this is killing me, but I don't know that I can change this. Yeah. And I want to, I know that I should, but I'm probably just going to die from this. Yeah. and you think, like, what are you saying? This is horrible. And yet I think there are times that we all say this when we, it certainly speaks to me. So, I love what you're saying, and I have never kind of focused on that angle or seen that in quite that same crystal way. And the fact that we all can come at it from our own experiences and find these little things that still resonate with us and still take on some additional meaning is amazing and phenomenal and beautiful.
And that's why I think this book's so important. That's why Alan, a lot of it, you hear a lot said about Alan Moore that, you can do that. And more so with Grant Morrison's work, like, you can reinterpret it again and again. And so I do get, frustrated with people when I talk to them and they've got like a definitive opinion of, well, no, this is how it is. and I'm always like, well, it's not like I've got I'm doing a big Superman series of episodes later in the year, and I've come across this whole thing of like what is Superman, like describing him as like the Ubermensch and Zeus and the Sun God and all these other interpretations. And I was like, oh yeah, but the fact you can say all those different things about this one person and actually was just created as an escapist character by two down on their luck Jewish sons of immigrants is incredible that it's come to that. And I think it's the same as Batman, really. Like everyone, The Dark Knight Returns had painted him as this sort of like character driven by an uncontrollable rage that just burned away at him and that sort of thing. And I think that's a real, almost like a sad interpretation. And I think this actually, in the way I see it, is almost like a lighter side that, yeah, he does have that grim and gritty side, but he wants to be a source of hope. He wants to prove that what he's doing is actually for the betterment of people rather than, Gotham and all this big concept. He actually wants to help individuals. And I think that's the Batman is a person that wants to help. It's actually quite almost an inspiring story. And I can take that from this book.
I like that interpretation, and I like that interpretation better than where I've gone with Batman. I think that some of where what I like about just he's the self-made man who wants to make Gotham better and really help people. Obviously, in the wake of our politics and income disparity, it's really easy for me to my trigger with Batman now is anything that makes me feel like he's just a rich guy who likes beating up poor people.
Yes.
And what are you doing not giving this money to like soup kitchens? You always get the little gestures that he's doing charity, but that's never the point of the story. And often those charities are really shell companies to embezzle money or or to shift money toward laser satellites or something. And that whole classist angle in a really Ayn Randian kind of way ticks me off. And maybe Batman is just this corrosive vigilante figure who by all rights should be admired by survivalists more than young hipster people living in the cities. And that's hard for me to shake. And so I love what you're saying, because that's a Batman who I still love. Some part of me still loves. I still want to get behind.
Yeah, I know what you mean. In modern day, it's funny because again, I did I recently did an episode on Rambo, and we were talking about sort of like 80s politics and Reagan era, and Reagan declaring that John Rambo is a Republican. And when I was looking at it, I was like, there's in this modern day, when you look at certain interpretations of Batman, whether it be the Dark Knight Returns or even the Killing Joke and other sort of, especially in the 90s and even some of the early 2000s, there's no escaping that, Bruce Wayne's probably a Republican. He's funneling money. He's a 1% and all that kind of thing. And then you read, there was a story, obviously, Scott Snyder's story, Endgame, which he did, in which sort of like, Batman lost his sense memory, everything. He lost his ability to be Batman. And he went, and his natural inclination was to turn that wealth and to go work in a children's shelter. He lost the grief and he lost the pain, and so he did actually use that money then for good. And I sort of take that now that, like, yes, he wants to do well, but psychologically, this is almost like the only way he sees that he can do it and handle his ongoing trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real difficult one. It's quite an interesting way to sort of interpret the character.
Yeah, I've read that, and I do like the idea. I do think it is fine to read a story about a 1%er who has a good heart, and obviously they do exist, right? I always come back to, because I also wrote a book on Batman Begins. I come back to the Nolan trilogy, and I feel like it's so set up in that first film that both Thomas and Bruce tried to help Gotham, but they did it in different ways. Thomas built a monorail system. He's doing public transit, right? He's doing charitable works. He's a doctor. He's a healer. He is the sort of philanthropic, liberal, rich guy. And Bruce goes out and beats people up.
Yeah.
Bruce goes out and spends all his money, and it's this like Ayn Rand. He never talks about social causes of crime, which is clearly Thomas's perspective. Bruce is just, you are accountable for your actions. And, I might have compassion and let somebody off now and then, but I mean, crime, is a plague, and it's an individual failing, not a social problem. And in my first adventure, we're going to destroy the beautiful mass transit system that my dad built, and I'm never going to bother to rebuild it because that stuff doesn't matter. And I think that these are two responses to not just crime, but also about, a kind of individual responsibility. Do we solve social issues through social programs or, and look at where people come from? Or do we just say, look, you guys are drug dealers. I'm gonna beat you up or arrest you and throw you in jail for decades. Bruce is obviously, on that second side that I don't really agree with. And even though I thrill to him as Batman and everything else. And I felt like that was so carefully set up in that first film that they really missed the opportunity in the third film to have him realize that. You have those charities going on in Rises that Bruce hasn't even, they've shut their doors, and, Bruce is like kicking orphans out on the street, and he's not even aware of it. So, I mean, I think that kind of central dynamic from what I saw in Batman Begins has stuck with me about the character. And I always want, obviously I like Batman, but I want there to be that kind of responsibility of wealth and privilege. And I don't usually see it. I mean, Snyder shows it somewhat, but.
Well, it's quite difficult. I wonder, it's one of those, he's a character that was invented in, the late 30s off the back of the Great Depression. And, they were looking just for, at that point, really sort of like a crime noir hero. That's all he was. And it was a novelty to have that sort of the rich playboy by day and the crime fighter by night was no different to Lamont Cranston and the Shadow or the Spider or, these other things, the pulp heroes from earlier in the decade. But like you say, almost 100 years on, 80 years on sort of thing, does it still stand? I mean, could you... I mean, Iron Man is still one of Marvel's biggest draws, especially in the cinematic universe, and he is the 1%er in that group. He's an industrialist. He's literally an arms dealer at one point, but he tries to turn things around. But even, like, say, in the films, they've never addressed the fact that this is a mega, mega, mega rich person who flies around in an armored suit and doesn't actually do anything to look at great, causes.
Well, not only that, but I mean, he supposedly learns his lesson in the first movie. Iron Man 2 starts off with him telling off Congress. Just saying, I will not be accountable to the government. This kind of power is better off in my hands in the private sector than with elected officials. Now, that is an anti-evolutionary statement. I mean, imagining that's the equivalent of Boeing or, an arms manufacturer saying, we're not going to license this stuff to you. We're not going to let you know how this works. This is better off with a corporate CEO running it because you guys in government don't know what you're doing and can't be trusted. That is such a far-right statement. Probably that company would be broken up and 90% of all respective countries' populations would be horrified by how extreme that statement is. And he's also the cause of Ultron, of every single problem. The Avengers and he has had to deal with, which have killed lots of people and destroyed cities. All of it is down to him. And everybody is totally fine with him controlling this. And he was drunk, flying it around drunk. He's a bad guy.
Oh yeah, the fact that by the end of Age of Ultron, the fact that he's not doing time in prison, I was a little bit baffled by. But the same goes for sort of, like you say, the modern interpretation of Batman, like what you say about the films, the Batman in BVS, like the Batman versus Superman. He's a mega rich guy. He's got no problem going around branding people, beating people, and I know it's meant to be a part of the story arc. But then at one point, he happily drives his almost indestructible Batmobile through a whole bunch of buildings down by a docking yard that may not have the insurance to cover the damage that he's creating with his indestructible tank. And it all feels a little bit...
He's always destroying buildings. And you can say, oh yeah, there's insurance, but unoccupied buildings have people in them all the time, and even where somebody has to, reconstruct it could be, a small businessman, it could be a big company. People are going to be out of business if they can't work at those docks. There are consequences to these actions of using the city as your rich boy playground to blow stuff up in. And that stuff repulses me now. But I think, when I was a kid, I just thought this was fun and cool. And it's okay because he's the hero in the same way that those movies position both Bruce and Tony Stark as the hero. So whatever they do, even if they torture somebody, that's okay. If you read a news report of somebody who was branding somebody, you'd say, lock them up.
This is what I get into about the Killing Joke, which I find, really putting it back to this. What we've talked about here is this cycle. And I do find that this book is almost a representation of the cyclical nature of the violence in the Batman comics in particular. That they can't seem to get away, no matter how, the Batman's desire to help the Joker in this, to make him, to give him the opportunity to be better, is the olive branch that they keep throwing into these comics, whether it be Scott Snyder or Ed Brubaker or even Tom King now, whoever, they'll throw these little bits in. But then you get the third act again, where it ends up being punching and violence and all that sort of thing, and you just can't get away from that. And I almost feel that that's what the joke is. That's the Killing Joke, that there will never be an ultimate end to this. There's never going to be an actual killing. The joke is the cycle of violence. Like we're on this, this hamster wheel, and it's going to keep going. That's the joke to me. That no matter what you think is going to happen, it's always going to keep going.
Well, that gets back to what you were saying earlier about how it could be both an embrace of and a commentary on, or a pull away from the sort of violence of 80s superhero comics. And what you said about the third act is true. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there's been a few counterexamples, but I don't know when I've ever hit the third act of a superhero movie and not just checked out and just said, all right, I get it. They're fighting. Let's get to the resolution already. And I'm watching, I could be watching $80 million on screen, and I'm bored. But that's me, and we are addicted not only to these movies, but to a kind of superhero structure that is about violence and is about a more badass villain who's dangerous. And because of that danger, it's very easy to see, the Avengers are the heroes here. And it's very hard to see, well, why didn't they at least alert the NYPD of an alien invasion? Those guys are trained. I trust them a lot more than I do a god from a parallel dimension. So, I mean, and I think that I've come to see this kind of violent narrative as the fact that these are all of our blockbusters as related to the sort of shift we've been seeing in politics, and some of these tough answers, that people think, well, the only solution is to be tough, and the reality of war is obscured from us. Because the reality of those buildings being smashed is obscured from us. And we're able to see somebody as a hero. I'm a lot more interested in a different kind of story. I'd rather see Bruce Wayne working in a soup kitchen for 2 hours. I swear to God. I'd rather, see, an entire movie condensed to the first act, and have the second and third act be Tony Stark dealing with the PTSD in Iron Man 3 without the villains. The fact that even when you do good things and save people, you have probably killed people and seen terrible things that will haunt you, and that's okay. And you know what? It's also okay for men to cry and be vulnerable, even when they're heroes. But good luck selling that as $1 billion franchise.
The one thing I'd say, though, the one thing that seems to have been a lesson for both the Marvel films and the backlash to Man of Steel and even Batman v Superman has been that consequences are becoming a part of the narrative. So as you say there, in Iron Man 3, Tony Stark, at least for 10 minutes, is suffering from PTSD. He has a trauma from almost dying in space. There are consequences to those actions. It's not the James Bond effect where he just goes from mission to mission to mission, where he goes off and sleeps with women, kills all these people, and then goes on to the next mission. They seem to have consequences. And the same with, you can see that there are issues from Winter Soldier that track into Age of Ultron, which track into Civil War, which track. I almost feel that some of the top level Marvel films themselves are trying to almost now start to comment on the fact that actually, yeah, these aren't self-contained adventures, and you know what, blowing the crap out of a place does have a consequence. And I think Civil War actually, to an extent, had a good commentary on that. And that's one of the reasons I felt a little bit abashed by the sort of like, you know, the humor that then gets put into other films. I'm like, oh, you're sort of underplaying this. They're the stories I find more compelling when you've got to face up to the consequences of your actions.
Yeah, I agree with exactly what you're saying. I think that's a fair counterpoint, and I think that if these movies, you know, I mean, if the superhero genre doesn't just disappear like the Western or something, and we keep doing this and making these movies and television shows. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Jessica Jones. You know, Jessica Jones is all about the trauma of assault. And boy, did they get that right. And, there's no bad guy, that's going to destroy the world. Really, the Purple Man is, a very limited threat compared to most of what you've seen. But she never goes down a hallway or opens a door where I'm not at the edge of my seat thinking, is she going to lose herself? Who's going to pop out? And I think that as time goes on, I do hear, at least in the popular press, a lot of demand for something different. And even if there isn't necessarily a demand for, there might be a demand for showing these consequences, but just the fact that if we keep doing this and keep making more and more movies and more TV shows, somebody's going to get this right, and somebody's going to push further into these areas and give us that more humanistic moment that gets back to Batman trying to save the Joker, and not just to, isn't it fun, traumatizing Gordon and celebrating violence.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's quite funny because I it's like the CW shows that exist at the moment, and I dip in and out of them, to be honest. I watched Arrow for a while, but the only thing with Arrow is now that everything's gone on, why would you live in that city? And that's the thing I can never get past. I get that this is a superhero soap opera, but I'm still curious as to why. I find the thing, and that's the problem I have with many of sort of the comics as well. Like, I prefer the more self-contained ones, and when you get to the big bombastic ones, like the Justice League go from city-destroying event to city-destroying event, I'm just like, where do these people live? And what are their premiums on home insurance? Like, it must be through the roof.
Right, and also, like, how does religion and consequently politics change when you have a Norse god who's really a god hanging out? I mean, and how does that change in response to city-destroying traumas? You think about how much 9/11, not only, you're talking about 3,000 people. It's really not that many people historically. It's a lot, but it's not losing tens of thousands or a war. But the country was completely traumatized. We set up an entire third branch of government, the extrajudicial, unaccountable court system. We completely redid the structure of the American government and funded contractors. All of this stuff with Snowden and all was a consequence of that, because we were handing out security clearances to everyone because we were so desperate to amp up the terrorism fight. Really, a lot of things changed because of 3,000 deaths in a traumatic, shocking manner.
Yeah. And that's
the world's going to change.
Exactly. And this is the thing, I think, and, I know they tried to make these, they're not in real world, but I don't, for all the ongoing, I get the comics and the soap operas, and I do enjoy them, and I can't deny that I read them, but there are certain ones that I'm a really big fan of Moon Knight, and I think he's been handled well, and I think he's been handled badly, but when he's handled well is when they really get into like his psychological trauma and that sort of thing, and it's not a massive earth-shattering thing. It's literally one guy dealing with an acknowledgement that I am actually suffering from something, and I'm trying to be a hero, or am I being a hero because I'm suffering from this mental illness? That sort of thing. It's those questions that I find interesting.
I agree completely.
But the one thing I would say is, a commentary on, everyone talks about Watchmen as a commentary on the evolution of the superhero comic. I don't disagree because I do love Watchmen. I think it's a great piece of work, and both artistically and technically. But actually, from a standpoint of the impact of a superhero on the real world, I think Miracle Man, Alan Moore's Miracle Man, and Neil Gaiman's Miracle Man is actually a much better commentary and statement on that. I mean, have you read it? I'm assuming you have.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've written 70,000 words on it.
Oh, really?
You are preaching to the choir. I definitely choose Miracle Man over Watchmen. And, so much of it goes back to issue 16 there of the world being restructured and radically reorganized. And I think that if you run any superhero or kind of sci-fi franchise forward, you might be able to get 1, 2, 3 movies, you might be able to get a few seasons, but the world is going to radically change.
Yeah.
The technology the Fantastic Four have, I mean, they can cure cancer. Don't tell me they can't.
Yeah.
Like, now we live in a world where everybody's saying that, AIDS is a conspiracy is reasonable. That's not wackadoo thinking if you live in a universe with the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine how just knowing alien life exists would totally transform our concept of ourselves as a species, let alone gods on other planets and, cities being destroyed. I mean, you run this clock forward enough and you're going to get Miracle Man. You're going to get at least some radical change. And so I agree 100% with what you're saying. I want to high-five you.
And that's it. I'm so glad you said, because it's one of those books that I think has got, Marvel reprinted it quite a few years ago now, and it got a little bit of its due, but I think it gets lost in the fold, really. I mean, I think it should get elevated and it should get so much more attention than it is, but because the inevitability of that conflict at the end is so earth-shattering that it literally changes the world's psyche to who Miracle Man is, and the religion changes, science changes, social structures change.
Absolutely, and we need. I mean, those are things that I think so many people focus on the Moore issues, and I love the Moore issues. But Gaiman weaves stories about social change that are moving and deep, and that I come back to and think about just in daily life. That I think about when we talk about like fragile masculinity and men struggling with supporting their families in a world where they want the James Bond girl, they want they're constantly being infused with these narratives that say you can't show emotion, you have to be this tremendous financial success. I mean, Donald Trump says it, I must be a very stable genius because look at my my money, my bank account. I mean, that mentality really exists. How much worse would masculinity be if you had superheroes in a world with Superman? I mean, Lex Luthor's psychology, especially in the last 20 years, that's been played up of like, I can no longer be the alpha man on the planet no matter how smart I am because this alien is here. Yeah, most, at least 50% of Western men are going to react in some way like that. And that's going to come out in whether there's a radical change in masculinity or, there's a rise in abuse or survivalists or something. I mean, that's going to come out in a lot of weird directions. Just the presence of the superhero transforms ourselves and our concepts of masculinity and indeed femininity. I mean, we've seen that with like the Wonder Woman movie. That was just a movie. And there were so many girls who said, oh my God, I left that theater thinking, I can do anything, and I was riding a high for 2 minutes. Is this how men feel after every action movie? And even that was a movie, and that moved people and encouraged people. So yeah, I mean, I'm amazed by exactly what you're saying, and those are stories that I want to read. And it is kind of heartbreaking that. I mean, I guess we're still waiting on Buckingham and Gaiman to do the next couple storylines, but it's kind of heartbreaking that I guess it took so long that by the time Marvel did those editions, they were a little too expensive and people had downloaded it on the internet. And also, if they had come out 10 years earlier, I mean, anything that Alan Moore had touched was going to be a
Yes.
bestseller. And 10 years later, I mean, he's definitely revered, but, it's a little more complicated, nuanced picture.
But I'll say right now, right here, for anyone listening, seriously, go check out the complete Alan Moore and then the Neil Gaiman Silver Age Miracle Man, because they are outstanding, absolutely outstanding, and really, really worth checking out.
I agree, and I'll say this, just one last thought about that is I love Watchmen. I go back to Watchmen a lot, but Watchmen doesn't make me cry. Watchmen makes me think about things, but it doesn't move me. Moore's Miracle Man and Gaiman's Miracle Man moves me, and I can sit there crying sometimes over how beautiful and how painful underneath it is that our world is so different.
The final act, the final book in that series, in Moore's 3-book structure, is so moving. I mean, spoilers, just in case nobody said to go read it, but there's a moment where Miracle Man's, I won't say his alter ego, but his human persona, he literally acknowledges his own superfluousness. He's like, well, I don't actually contribute anything to this situation. So he gives up. He sort of, in all intents and purposes, he commits suicide in order for Miracle Man to take over permanently. And it's really sad that he's like, that other person is a sacrifice. He sacrifices himself after going through everything for the betterment of the world without ever being acknowledged. And I think it's that moment always spoke to me in that book. So
that moment speaks to me too. I mean, I feel it as you're talking, and I think that, to some degree that is, we were talking about how the world changes when you run that story forward long enough. When you run these stories forward long enough with any superhero who has an alter ego, you're going to reach some kind of crisis point like that, where obviously Superman is going to live for a very long time.
Yeah.
Clark Kent might be who he is to identify with people, and you can argue, if that's the real person or not. But Clark Kent's not going to be able to hide the fact that he can't age in, 2250. And at some point, Superman's psychology is going to change. I mean, if you can fly into outer space and look at the world and see it as a fragile blue ball anytime you want, boy, the daily petty stuff that Clark Kent does is I don't know. I mean, it might be what you really love about life, but I mean,
you become Dr. Manhattan.
What?
You end up becoming Dr. Manhattan. You lose.
Oh, yeah.
You could potentially lose your humanity. That's that's it. That's the inevitable next step, isn't it?
Right. Or at least at some point you say this bifurcated personality served a function that I no longer need.
Yeah.
I can just be Kal-El, and I can do the domestic stuff if I still care about it, if I love these human moments, if I I mean, it depends how you see Superman's character, whether he goes the Dr. Manhattan route or not. But even if he doesn't, there comes a point at which you don't need Clark Kent.
We're gonna start to wrap up there, because that's been considering we started with talking about the Killing Joke, we've gone some really interesting places. So
I think it's stuff that's in there in the Killing Joke. I mean,
it is.
It is tensions in the Killing Joke that promote these conversations,
which is why it's lasted 30 years, and hopefully will go on to be an important book.
I'm into that.
So quickly, we're going to wrap up. Please give Sequart a boost. Where can they find it?
We're at sequart.org. That's SEQUART, like SE Quart. It's short for sequential art. SEQUART.org.
Excellent. And I do recommend it. I've got your early Grant Morrison book, the essays on Watchmen. Well, I've got a few actually. I've got quite a few. They're brilliant. They're absolutely excellent, and highly recommend them. So we shall wrap up on that one. That's been fantastic. But do you want to?
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here.
No, it's been fun. I'm really glad you did it. Well, there we go. The interview with Julian Darius. Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Excellent conversation. Really insightful. I didn't realise I was going to be sort of expounding on The Killing Joke as much as that, but it was fantastic. I will be getting Julian back at some point to talk more comics and superhero things. But in the meantime, if you want to get in contact with us in any way, please feel free to do so. I'm on at 20th Century Geek Twitter, 20th Century Geek at gmail.com, and of course on Facebook, on Tumblr, and all those other things as well, Instagram, all under 20th Century Geek. So please reach out, say hello, give us some feedback, everything else. Now, two things more important. Firstly, one of the platform, we are on Patreon. So please, if you want us to help keep the lights on, go ahead and make a donation. Every penny counts, as they say. Now, final thing, I just want to reach out and say thank you very much to Fitz at Narrative Audio. He graciously edited and put this episode together, and I highly recommend that you seek them out. That's Narrative Audio on Twitter. There is a link to their website on there, and all of his services and everything's available on there. So, until next time, thank you very much, and I shall see you again soon.